Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft Legion beta video. Today we're going to be going over my favorite melee specs in the game. So the format of this is I'll do my top 5 and then I'll say a quick piece on all the other melee specs. Of course, as you know, with my range GPS video, it's all just personal opinion based on my testing throughout the beta, so bear that in mind. Anyway, let's get right into the list, which is in no particular order, and I'll be starting off with the Enhancement Shaman. It's a really well executed spec that nails its objectives in just about every regard. The gameplay is great, visuals are great, and it totally nails the class fantasy. As far as the core of the spec goes, well, it's a builder spender that also involves maintaining uptime on a number of personal buffs. You use a resource called Maelstrom to execute your main abilities. It's generated by your auto attacks, and then Rockbiter or Boulder Fist if you talent into it. This Maelstrom is then spent on a few different abilities, so Storm Strike is your big hitter, it's on a haste affected cooldown. Stormbringer is a passive that can prog an instant half-price Storm Strike, which is pretty sweet, and then on top of that you're also managing your Flame Tongue, your Frostbrand if you've taken a certain talent, and then burning off your excess Maelstrom on Lavalash. What works really well here is you do need to think about your Maelstrom. You need to ensure that you always have enough of it to use Storm Strike on cooldown, and that does include having a Stormbringer proc, so if you just are reckless and spam all your resources away in Lavalashes, then you'll find yourself caught out and not able to make the best use of the resources that you generate. So overall, I think the core of it plays really quite well. The talent selection for enhancement is pretty fantastic too. It offers a good range of talents which modify how you interact with Maelstrom as a resource and the overall pace of the spec. The artifact weapon ability is also really satisfying to use if you play your cards right, and AoE is just tremendously fun on enhancement. The animations, as you can probably see, are quite the thing to behold, and there's some excellent sound effects as well. So the Enhancement Shaman, like the Unholy DK, which I think I'll cover next, really is the complete package. It succeeds well in just about every element of what makes a spec great. So, Unholy DK time. The Unholy DEATHKNIGHT took me by surprise when I did my more recent wave of testing on it. The spec manages to be decently complex and have a really well-refined class fantasy. So first, you no longer have different types of runes. You instead have 6 runes, 3 of which will actually charge at a time. You use your Festering Strike to apply Festering Wounds on the target. Now this will apply between 2 and 4 of them on the target at random. You can then pop these wounds using Scourge Strike. Now both of these abilities spend runes, so they generate runic power, which you'll want to burn off by using, I think, Death Coil. This spec essentially has 3 resources to balance: your runic power, your runes themselves, and then Festering Wounds, which have a maximum cap of 8. And generally, using one resource generates some of the other, so there's a balancing act in ensuring that you keep all of your abilities on cooldown while managing your resources without going over the cap for any of them. The balancing act requires a good bit more focus than some other specs, which is definitely nice, and it's something that I found to be very satisfying to play, even when you're just whacking a target dummy. The talents are really great too, with ones like Soul Reaper integrating into the sort of interplay of all these resources quite well, and overall, it's just a really good selection. The artifact weapon ability also does a lot of damage, and it bursts every Festering Wound on the target, so as you can imagine, you can set up some very sort of satisfying usages of that ability. So overall, it's got the depth to remain interesting for quite a long time, it's got great visuals, and a really cool overall fantasy. And next we've got the Fury Warrior. So it's been a fan favourite since the beginning of the beta due to its pretty amazing set of animations. The actual gameplay has varied as betas progressed, and I'm happy to say that I think Blizzard have managed to deliver a really fun class to play, bar Furious Strike, which is the same as Wild Strike, which still feels pretty rubbish. Anyway, you generate fury by auto-attacking using Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst crits enrage you. When you're enraged, you can use Raging Blow, and there's a new ability in the mix called Rampage, which is really cool, and it will enrage you, so on top of being a damage source and a rage sink, sort of spender, it also doubles as a way to counteract bad RNG when it comes to being enraged. You can also make Raging Blow usable outside of Enrage on a cooldown via talent, and overall there's a good mix of abilities here that work quite well together, and it's backed up by some absolutely fantastic animations. As a suggestion, I would like it if Furious Strike maybe incurred half the global cooldown and perhaps had another mechanic on top of it. I think some of the problems with it feeling boring would be helped if we could just make it feel a bit more unique rather than just a shitty last resort if you've had bad luck with your crits. Its talent system for Fury is also quite great. It offers a good few playstyles and some good situational builds as well. Now overall, it's not the most complex spec ever, but I think it manages to sell the fantasy of being this massive hulking berserker that smashes everything around them. Overall, I think it's very fun to level with, and the dungeons that I've done on the Fury Warrior have also been very fun indeed. So yeah, overall, Fury is really cool, and there's also some great times where you can, like line up an avatar with something else, you sort of like, an avatar and a blade storm, and that just does so much damage, and it feels great to use. Anyway, let's move on to the Windwalker Monk. So their spells are definitely familiar, however, Windwalker as a spec has changed a lot in Legion, and I really like the previous version of the Windwalker Monk. However, the good news is, I'm happy to say I like this version of it even more. The playstyle is all based off their mastery, which causes attacks that are different from your previous attack to do around 20% more damage. Basically, you can't use the same, Basically, you don't want to be using the same attack twice in a row because you'll lose the benefit of that mastery. This, along with the balance of their spell cooldowns, their talents, and their resource management, makes it feel a lot more deliberate, a lot less spammy, and overall very well thought out and quite rhythmic, as if you're playing this strange version of like Guitar Hero or DDR, which is a bit weird, but I think it does work out really well. Now, the mechanics surrounding this mastery is the sort of main thing you need to pay attention to when you're playing the spec, and it's what mainly sort of informs your, second-to-second rotation. One thing that you will have remembered from the previous version of the Windwalker Monk is the entire Tiger Eye brew mechanic, where you generate charges of the brew and then you can chug them to do lots of damage. Basically, it was a really cool cooldown as far as how it worked. However, I can see why Blizzard would scrap that mechanic and go in this direction. Yes, I think this version is a bit easier, but I still think it is quite fun, and it still is a punishing mechanic, so while it is easy, if you don't pay attention, you will definitely lose out. Talent choices are also really solid, many of them slot into this combo system quite well, and they've also simplified Storm, Earth, and Fire, which is a decision that overall I am happy with. Now, their mobility is unrivaled and absolutely will beat out a Demon Hunter in terms of distance travelled, though of course monks cannot glide, which is the unique thing that Demon Hunters can do. So overall, I just think it's a really well designed, really well paced, really engaging spec that is very, very satisfying to play. And finally, for the top 5, we're going to cover Frost. Worth saying that Frost perhaps is a little bit lower than the first 4 that I covered, but it still is really fun. So the Frost DK is a bit more simplistic than Unholy, but I think it plays out quite excellently overall, and again it manages to nail both the gameplay and the class fantasy. Just like with Unholy, it's got the new rune system, but unlike Unholy, it isn't really a full revamp, so mechanics like Rhyme and Killing Machine are back. Really, it's the core of the Frost DK that I think you already know, but inserted into a fun new resource system with a pretty good set of talents overall. There are 1 or 2 that are kind of boring to me, but I think others are really quite cool indeed. I especially like, say, Breath of Sindragosa, where you can use that and then play your cards right and maintain a really, really long duration for it. I think that's a very satisfying way to play the game, and it definitely feels like your planning and decision-making pays off there. So overall, while it is a bit less deep than Unholy, I think it's extremely fun to play and absolutely is a visual treat. So with my favourite 5 specs covered, let's just go through the other ones, and it's worth saying that most of these are pretty decent and there's only a few that I don't really like that much. I'm going to start off with Rogues because I've seen a lot of criticism be levelled at them in Legion, and while I do understand and to a degree agree, I think that Outlaw and Subtlety actually have some good value in their gameplay. First, Outlaw. It's a simple spec, that is for sure. While it's mostly a rebrand of the combat spec, I think that rebrand and retheming has actually been successful. It feels more thematically consistent, it feels more distinct, and overall, I think that works out really well. While the core rotation is very simple indeed, Roll the Bones is a tremendously fun talent to play around with. While the core rotation is very simple indeed, Roll the Bones is a tremendously fun ability to play around with, though perhaps not when raiding. Essentially, it gives you a few buffs out of a pool of 6. Which buffs you get and the different possible combinations will completely change how the gameplay actually feels and the stuff you need to react to. Basically, the gameplay is all about your ability to see what buffs you've got and then how to sort of play around that right. The buffs themselves are definitely quite cool, especially the one that decreases the cooldown of, well, your cooldowns when you spend combo points. The spec ends up actually being so fast that it's almost hard to keep up with, and I do think there is a good degree of skill in reacting properly to all of those various different situations that Roll the Bones can get you into. The downside here is that the potential for widely variable DPS is massive. Now, it is true that it will average out over time, but the difference between getting a good pull, where heroisms went off, you've used Roll the Bones, and it's just, it's a perfect storm, and then a bad pull where, pull of a boss where perhaps, you've got a pretty bad roll of Roll the Bones. Well, that is, that's going to be a big source of frustration, I think, for many players, and that's worth bearing in mind. There's also some concerns of, well, if you do Roll the Bones and you don't get the best choice, do you want to then re-roll it? That will all depend on the balancing once we hit endgame, but there is potential for some frustration in these mechanics. That said, I do think that they are very cool mechanics, and certainly for leveling and doing non-raid content, it absolutely is a very enjoyable spec, at least for me to play. Next, we've got Subtlety, so it drew a lot of criticism. Initially, Blizzard made some good changes, but those changes have still left some sub-rogues unsatisfied, which is totally fair enough. For me, though, I found the spec to be quite simple, but overall something that did work. It had a pretty solid flow, and I like how the new Shadow Dance works for what it is. Of course, being a rogue is generally quite nice and quite fun, because you've got access to cool abilities like Feint, Cloak of Shadows, Shadow Step. So overall, it's a spec that I do find to be quite fun to play in short bursts, though I do accept that its changes aren't really sitting well with everyone, and I suspect that how much you like Sub might depend on how much you like the current version of it on Warlords of Draenor. I don't have much experience with the current version, so I can't talk to what's been lost. All I can say is I played the Legion Sub for a bit, and yeah, it was pretty decent. Didn't blow me away like the first 5 specs that I talked about in this video did. But yeah, it was a pretty solid thing. And then finally, Assassination completely lost me. I found its rotation to be a bit slow, a bit simple, very bland, and generally just quite unsatisfying. I didn't mind it in Warlords as a simple spec to level up with, but for me, in Legion, it's just not as fun as the other 2 specs, or really most of the other specs in the overall melee roster. So while rogues have attracted criticism, as you can see, I did find some fun in 2 of their specs, though I totally understand how that might not apply to a lot of people. Next, we've got the Retribution Paladin, so again, I've seen quite a lot of criticism surrounding it. It doesn't blow me away, but I don't think it's that bad at all. The core rotation does work out quite well, and it's kind of satisfying to use, and there are some pretty cool talent choices, such as combining Justicar's Vengeance and Divine Purpose. I suspect the players who were in love with the Warlords of Draenor proc madness might be disappointed about how this spec plays, but perhaps players who were not a fan of that style of gameplay will be more positive to how Blizzard have designed Ret. For me, it's somewhere in the middle. It's not stellar, it's not bad either. There are just other spec choices that I enjoy more. And next we've got the HAVOC Demon Hunter. So first, it's best to try this yourself, and it's pretty easy to do because you can just make one. Some people really dislike the movement element of the gameplay here. Check out my video guide for this class overall to get a better idea, but basically I think that it's got a core toolkit that's maybe a little bit too simple, but is fun enough in small doses. I do like how the talents beef it out to the point where it overall is pretty decent, albeit, really quite exceptionally impressive to look at. So yeah, like the movement mechanics, they might end up being quite enjoyable if they fit your playstyle. They might not be. I just think this might be kind of like Marmite, and it's best to try it yourself, and that's very easy to do as long as you own Legions, so just go ahead and do that. Next, we've got Feral Druids, so they're quite similar, or at least familiar to how they play currently, and I found myself enjoying their gameplay. What I especially like is how snapshotting is basically a thing for them. Now, it isn't snapshotting based on your stats, rather it's snapshotting based on your buffs. This works out quite well with some of your talents and abilities, such that a decently simple core spec actually balloons to have a really good amount of gameplay with it. This is especially true if you use the Blood Talons talent or Savage Roar, which is now a talent. Now, I actually like Savage Roar being a talent. I didn't particularly like it as far as just the constant maintenance thing, and I still find there's really fun snapshotting gameplay between ensuring that your rips and your rakes are going off under the benefits of Tiger Fury and Blood Talons. So overall, yeah, Feral gets actually a pretty big thumbs up for me. Next, let's move on to the slightly less positive, where we have the Survival Hunter. I do like elements of the core design, but overall it just hasn't found the rhythm in its rotation that's satisfying to play. For whatever reason, I just sit down, I play survival, and it technically works, but it feels a bit clunky. There's times where RNG elements are very frustrating and feel like they're really limiting your access rather than being a burst of excitement that you need to react to. Yes, it's improved overall since the initial launch, but I think that there are other melee specs that are a lot more enjoyable than the Survival Hunter. And next, Arms Warrior. I still hate Arms Warrior. I've very heavily disliked it since, I can't remember exactly when, but I didn't like it in Warlords. I still don't like it. The entire mechanic around Colossal Smash just sucks the life out of most of the rotation for me. Even with a full artifact weapon, I just feel beholden to the procs. I'm sitting there spamming Smash. It just is not fun at all to me, and I do understand that there are people who enjoy ARMS, and that's great, fair enough, but it just doesn't work out for me. And with ARMS covered, that's actually it. That's all of the specs covered, so there you go. That's all of my thoughts. Overall, I'm actually decently happy with how this stuff has came out for Legion. Of course, we will need to do some more raid testing. There are some concerns about, say, RNG with a few specs and what that means for you if you're a raider. But for the most part, yeah, as I said, like, I'm pretty happy. I really do appreciate the refocusing towards class fantasy. I think it has actually just made quite a few specs feel a lot more satisfying to play, even if they have mostly similar abilities. So overall, that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments or via Twitter, which is the best place to get a hold of me. And with that, I will see you next time.